There is a force operating inside you right now that you probably cannot name. It is older than language. It is older than civilization. It is, in many ways, older than the part of you that considers itself a thinking, reasoning, self-aware human being. It was there before you had words for it. It was there before you had memories, and it has been shaping nearly every decision you have made since the day you were born. That force is desire. Right now, as you listen to this, you are being held in the grip of it. You desired to learn something. You desired to understand yourself more deeply. You desired, perhaps, to feel less alone in the strange and urgent hungers you carry around every single day. And so you pressed play, and here you are. Think about the last major decision you made. Maybe it was a career move. Maybe it was ending or beginning a relationship. Maybe it was as simple as choosing what to eat for dinner, or staying up far too late, scrolling through your phone when your body was crying out for sleep. Whatever that decision was, desire was behind it. Not logic, not reason, not some perfectly calculated cost-benefit analysis in your mind. Desire. We tell ourselves that we are rational creatures. We tell ourselves that we weigh our options, consider the consequences, and choose wisely. But the science of human behavior, the accumulated wisdom of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy across centuries, tells a very different story. The truth is that most of us are being led by our desires far more than we are leading them. Most of us are passengers in a vehicle driven by forces we barely understand. And here is what makes this so fascinating, and in some ways so urgent. Desire is not the enemy. It is not a flaw in the human design. Desire is what gets you out of bed in the morning. Desire is what makes you fall in love. Desire is what drives artists to create, scientists to discover, entrepreneurs to build, and athletes to push past every known limit of the human body. Desire is the engine of nearly everything remarkable that human beings have ever done. But desire, when misunderstood, when chased blindly, when confused with need, becomes a source of extraordinary suffering. The same force that propels people toward their greatest achievements can keep them perpetually dissatisfied, endlessly restless, always reaching for something that never quite arrives. The same mechanism that made our ancestors survive can, in the modern world, make it nearly impossible to feel at peace. So what is desire exactly? Where does it come from? Why do we want the specific things we want and not other things? Why do some desires fill us with energy and purpose while others hollow us out? Why is it that getting what we want so often fails to give us what we thought it would? And most importantly, how do we live with desire in a way that serves us rather than enslaves us? These are not small questions. They are, in many ways, the most important questions a human being can ask. Because the quality of your inner life, the depth of your relationships, the direction of your ambitions, and the degree to which you feel genuinely fulfilled at the end of each day are all, at their root, questions about desire. This audiobook is an invitation to look at that force honestly, not to judge it, not to suppress it, not to pretend it does not exist or that you would be a better person if it did, but to understand it, because understanding desire is one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself. When you understand why you want what you want, you gain something rare in modern life: clarity. You begin to see which of your desires are truly yours and which have been handed to you by a culture that profits from keeping you perpetually unsatisfied. You begin to feel the difference between a desire that will genuinely enrich your life and one that will only leave you emptier than before, and you begin, slowly but unmistakably, to live with more intention, more freedom, and more peace. That journey begins right now, with a simple, honest question that most people never think to ask. Why do I want the things I want? To understand desire at its deepest level, we have to go back. Not just to your childhood, though we will get there. We have to go back much further than that. We have to go back to the very beginning of what it means to be human. Human beings did not arrive in the world the way we imagine we did, fully formed with tastes and preferences, neatly organized. We were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of survival pressure, by environments so harsh and so unpredictable that only creatures with powerful, urgent motivations could make it through. The desires you feel today, your hunger for food, for warmth, for connection, for status, for safety, for meaning, are not random. They are the echo of those ancient pressures, still vibrating in your nervous system, long after the original pressures have faded. Consider hunger. When you feel hungry, it does not feel like a philosophical choice. It feels like a demand. Your body insists. Your attention narrows. Food becomes the most important thing in the world, and everything else, your plans, your social obligations, your sense of dignity, temporarily recedes. That urgency was forged over millions of years of evolution. Organisms that felt hunger urgently enough to act on it survived. Organisms that did not respond quickly and powerfully enough to the signals of depletion died. So desire became survival. The same is true for social desire, the deep, almost physical need to belong, to be accepted, to matter to other people. For most of human history, being cast out of the group meant death. You could not hunt alone. You could not protect yourself alone. You could not raise children alone. Social connection was not a luxury. It was oxygen. And so the pain of rejection, the anxiety of disapproval, the desperate need to be seen and valued by others, all of that was baked into the human architecture. It was not weakness. It was wisdom encoded in the body. And then there is the desire for status. This one makes many people uncomfortable because we like to think of ourselves as above the desire for prestige, above caring what others think, above the petty scrambling for rank that we can see so clearly in others, but prefer not to acknowledge in ourselves. But status desire is just as ancient and just as biological as hunger. In small ancestral groups, your position in the social hierarchy determined your access to food, to mates, to protection, to resources. High status individuals survived and reproduced at higher rates, and so the drive to be respected, admired, and recognized was selected for over thousands of generations. It is not vanity, it is evolution. None of this means we are prisoners of our biology. Understanding where desires come from is not the same as saying we cannot change them or redirect them. But it does mean that if you try to simply will your desires away without understanding them, if you try to shame yourself for wanting things, or to convince yourself that your hungers are shameful, you will almost certainly fail. You are fighting against something far older and far more powerful than your conscious mind. The psychologist Abraham Maslow gave us one of the most enduring frameworks for understanding human needs and desires with his famous hierarchy. He proposed that human motivation operates in a kind of layered system. At the base are the most urgent physiological needs: food, water, shelter, sleep. These must be met before anything else becomes truly motivating. Once they are satisfied, safety becomes dominant. The need to feel secure, protected from harm, stable in one's environment. When safety is established, Social needs rise to the surface: belonging, love, friendship, the sense of being part of something. Above that comes esteem, the desire to be respected, to feel capable, to have standing in the eyes of others and in your own. And at the very top of the pyramid, Maslow placed self-actualization, the desire to become everything you are capable of becoming, to realize your full potential as a human being. What Maslow understood, and what decades of research has since reinforced, is that desire is not one thing. It is a family of drives, each with its own character, its own urgency, its own satisfaction profile. The desire for food is very different from the desire for recognition, which is very different from the desire for meaning. And one of the most common sources of confusion and suffering in modern life is that people try to satisfy one type of need with a completely different type of reward. They are hungry for connection, and they buy something. They are starving for meaning, and they pursue status. They long to feel safe on a deep emotional level, and they accumulate money long past the point where it provides any real security. The mismatch between what we actually need and what we pursue in its place is one of the defining tragedies of modern life. There is also the dimension of desire that psychology calls intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the desire that comes from inside, the pull you feel toward an activity or goal because it is genuinely meaningful or enjoyable to you. Extrinsic motivation is the desire for external rewards, for money, praise, status, or approval from others. Both are real, both are powerful, but they operate very differently in the human psyche. Research by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, who developed what is known as self-determination theory, consistently shows that when people are primarily motivated by intrinsic desires, they tend to experience more genuine satisfaction, greater persistence through difficulty, better psychological well-being, and deeper engagement with what they are doing. When motivation is primarily extrinsic, when the desire is for the reward rather than the activity itself, something subtle but important is lost. People become dependent on external validation to feel capable. They lose touch with what actually moves them, and the activities themselves often become less enjoyable the moment the external reward is introduced or removed. This has enormous implications for how we structure our desires and our goals. The person who pursues a career because it genuinely ignites something in them is living in a very different psychological reality than the person who pursues it purely for the salary or the prestige, even if their outward behavior looks identical. The former has a source of energy and meaning that sustains them through the inevitable difficulties. The latter is always calculating, always measuring, always one disappointment away from a crisis of motivation. But here is where it gets complicated. Most human desires are not purely intrinsic or purely extrinsic. They are mixed. You might genuinely love your work and also care deeply about being recognized for it. You might be authentically drawn to a relationship and also be motivated by the comfort and security it provides. You might pursue a goal for its intrinsic meaning and still find yourself powerfully influenced by what others will think of you. That mixture is not hypocrisy. It is humanity. The task is not to purify your desires into something perfectly noble, but to understand the full landscape of what you are actually chasing and to make sure the external rewards you pursue are aligned with the internal needs they are meant to satisfy. And underneath all of it, beneath the hierarchy of needs and the science of motivation, there is something even more fundamental: something that philosophers and spiritual traditions have grappled with for millennia. The human being is, at its core, a meaning-seeking creature. Not just a pleasure-seeking creature, not just a survival machine, a being that needs to feel that its life matters, that its desires point toward something real, that the striving and the longing and the reaching all add up to something. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps of World War II and wrote about the psychology of meaning in his landmark work, Man's Search for Meaning, observed that the deepest human desire is not for pleasure or power, but for meaning. He watched men die not from starvation or cold, but from the loss of any sense that their suffering was connected to something. And he watched others survive conditions of almost unimaginable horror because they had found, or refused to surrender, a sense of purpose. This is one of the most important things you can understand about desire. It is not just about wanting things. It is about wanting things that connect to something larger in yourself. When your desires are aligned with your deepest values, when what you are pursuing actually matters to you, at the level of who you want to be, they become a source of enormous energy and meaning. When your desires are disconnected from that core, when you are chasing things you do not truly care about because culture or fear or habit has told you to want them, they become a kind of spiritual exhaustion. Understanding why humans desire is the first step. The next step is to look at the hidden machinery that turns desire into behavior, the fascinating and sometimes disturbing neuroscience of what happens inside the brain when you want something. There is a chemical in your brain that is more responsible for your behavior than almost any other substance in the known universe. It is called dopamine. And almost everything you have heard about it is probably at least slightly wrong. Dopamine is commonly described as the pleasure chemical, the reward molecule, the feel-good neurotransmitter that floods your system when you eat something delicious, have sex, achieve a goal, or receive a compliment. And while dopamine is absolutely involved in all of those experiences, this description misses something crucial about what dopamine actually does. Because dopamine is not primarily the chemical of pleasure, dopamine is the chemical of wanting. This distinction, worked out through decades of careful neuroscience research, most famously by researchers like Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan, is one of the most important insights in modern psychology. Wanting and liking are not the same thing. They feel related. They often occur together, but they are neurologically distinct processes, and understanding the difference between them is essential to understanding why human beings so often pursue things that do not actually satisfy them. Berridge and his colleagues conducted a series of experiments with rats in which they carefully blocked the dopamine system while leaving the opioid system, which governs actual pleasure, intact. What they found was remarkable. Rats without dopamine would not seek out food. They would not press levers for rewards. They would not pursue anything at all. But if you placed pleasurable food directly in their mouths, they still showed the classic signs of enjoyment. Positive facial expressions, relaxed bodies, what researchers could recognize as contentment. The wanting had been eliminated. The liking remained. The reverse is also possible. It is possible to have wanting without much liking. This is the neural signature of craving, of the addict who desperately pursues the next fix, even though it no longer produces much genuine pleasure, of the person who cannot stop checking their phone, even though each check rarely produces anything that actually feels good, of the endless acquisitive loop that many people find themselves in, wanting, getting, feeling briefly satisfied, then wanting again almost immediately, the satisfaction never quite matching the anticipation. Dopamine, it turns out, is activated most powerfully not by rewards themselves, but by the anticipation of rewards and by the unpredictability of reward timing. This was discovered by accident in the 1970s by the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, who was studying dopamine neurons in monkeys. He found that when monkeys received a predicted reward, a burst of juice after a reliable cue, the dopamine neurons fired in anticipation of the cue, not when the juice arrived. And when the juice arrived as expected, there was no significant dopamine spike. The reward had been fully priced in, as financial analysts might say. The dopamine had already done its work. But here is the really interesting part. When the juice arrived unexpectedly, when there was no cue, or when the timing was unpredictable, the dopamine response was dramatically larger. The brain, it seems, is a prediction machine, and it is most energized not by certainty, but by the possibility of a reward that has not yet been confirmed. This is why gambling is so neurologically compelling. This is why social media is so difficult to put down. This is why the early stages of romantic infatuation are so intoxicating. Variable rewards, rewards that arrive on an unpredictable schedule, produce the most powerful dopamine responses. The slot machine does not pay out every time. The crush does not always text back immediately. The feed does not always contain something interesting. But sometimes it does, and that sometimes is enough to keep the dopamine system locked in a state of activated anticipation, burning with the desire to check again, to play again, to reach out again. Technology designers know this. They have known it for years. The infinite scroll, the notification badge, the like counter, the pull to refresh gesture that mimics the physical action of pulling a slot machine lever. All of these are deliberately engineered to exploit the dopamine system's preference for variable rewards. Your phone is not just a communication device. It is, at a neurological level, a dopamine delivery system, and it has been optimized by some of the most sophisticated engineers in the world to keep your wanting activated as continuously as possible. But technology is only the most recent and most visible example of a much older pattern. Human civilization has always been shaped by the mechanisms of desire and reward. Economies are built on the management and manipulation of desire. Religion has always grappled with the proper place of desire in human life. Philosophy, from Aristotle to Schopenhauer to William James, has tried to understand what desire is and how it should be directed. And throughout all of that history, one pattern appears again and again. The gap between wanting and having is a fundamental feature of human consciousness, not a bug. Consider what happens when you finally achieve something you have been wanting for a long time. A promotion, a relationship, a physical goal, a material acquisition. There is often, in the immediate aftermath of achievement, a brief, beautiful moment of satisfaction, a pause in the wanting, a quiet, and then, sometimes surprisingly quickly, the wanting starts again. The goal post moves, the next desire rises, the baseline shifts. What was once a coveted prize becomes the new floor from which the next desire launches. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation, the tendency of human beings to return, fairly quickly, to a stable emotional baseline after both positive and negative life events. A landmark study by Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, published in 1971, compared the reported happiness levels of lottery winners people who had recently been paralyzed in accidents, and a control group. The results were stunning and disturbing in equal measure. Within roughly a year, lottery winners were no happier than the control group, and accident survivors, while still facing profound challenges, had adapted to their new circumstances to a degree that external observers consistently underestimated. The implication is uncomfortable but important. Getting what you want is a less reliable path to lasting happiness than we tend to assume. Because the brain is designed not to stay satisfied, but to keep wanting. Satisfaction signals that a need has been met. Once that signal is received, the system recalibrates and begins looking for the next unmet need. This is not a design flaw. In the environment of evolutionary adaptation, this restlessness was essential. The organism that remained satisfied and stopped seeking was the organism that got eaten or starved. The discontented, always striving organism survived. But in the modern world, where many of our most fundamental needs are met in ways that would have seemed miraculous to our ancestors, this perpetual wanting engine runs on without an off switch. We have shelter, and we want a bigger house. We have food, and we want a specific cuisine. We have connection, and we want more followers. We have safety, and we want certainty about the future. The machinery of desire does not know when to stop, because it was never designed to stop. It was designed to keep driving us forward. None of this means that achievement is meaningless, or that working toward goals is a waste of time. But it does mean that if you locate your happiness entirely in the moment of getting what you want, you will spend almost all of your life in a state of wanting something you do not have, and the wanting will feel more urgent and real than anything you already possess. There is a beautiful irony buried in the neuroscience here. Dopamine, the chemical most associated with pursuing goals and rewards, is also the chemical most active during anticipation, during the journey toward the goal, during the richness and possibility of not yet having. There is often more aliveness in the pursuit than in the arrival, more energy in the reaching than in the possessing. Which means that if you can learn to be fully present in the process of pursuing what matters to you, rather than deferring all your meaning and satisfaction to the moment of achievement, you gain access to something extraordinary, a life in which the majority of your time, the time spent working toward your goals, rather than just reaching them, is vivid and engaged and meaningful. The problem is that most people are barely present during the pursuit. They are mentally already at the destination, measuring the gap between where they are and where they want to be, feeling the distance as a kind of lack rather than a kind of aliveness. They have all the restlessness of wanting without the richness that comes from being fully immersed in the journey. Understanding the dopamine system also illuminates something important about the modern epidemic of numbness and boredom. When dopamine is chronically overstimulated, as happens with heavy social media use, constant novelty, seeking, or substance use, the brain responds by downregulating its sensitivity to dopamine. The receptors become fewer and less responsive. What once produced a strong response now barely registers. And ordinary life, life without the constant stimulation, begins to feel flat and gray and unbearable. This is not a moral failing. It is simple neurochemistry. The brain is trying to maintain equilibrium in an environment of excess stimulation. The path back from that numbness is not, as it turns out, more stimulation. It is less. It is the deliberate cultivation of what might initially feel like boredom, quiet time, unhurried presence, engagement with things that require effort and do not immediately deliver a hit of novelty. The brain gradually recalibrates. The receptors slowly return to their natural sensitivity, and eventually, ordinary life, a conversation with a friend, a walk outside, a meal eaten without a screen, begins to feel genuinely pleasurable again. This is one of the most counterintuitive gifts that understanding the neuroscience of desire can give you, the knowledge that the path to richer experience often runs through voluntary simplicity rather than more stimulation, not because pleasure is bad, but because the mechanism that allows you to experience pleasure requires periods of rest and calibration to function well. Let me tell you about a man named Marcus. Marcus grew up in a modest household in a mid-sized city, the son of a postal worker and a teacher's aide. Money was always tight, not desperately so, but tight enough that the absence of certain things was always visible: the cheaper shoes, the older car, the vacations that did not happen. Marcus noticed early and acutely the difference between what his family had and what some of his classmates had. And he decided, with the clean, burning certainty that only a teenager can feel, that he would be different. He would have more. He would build a life that looked nothing like the one he grew up in. He was not wrong to want more. His desire for something better was real and legitimate and, in many ways, admirable. It drove him to study harder than his peers, to take extra shifts through college, to say no to distractions that consumed others his age. By his late 20s, Marcus had built something genuinely impressive: a successful career in finance, a generous salary, an apartment in the kind of building he used to look at from the bus window as a teenager and think someday. He had arrived. He had the things he had promised himself he would have. And yet, he was 32 years old and lying in his expensive apartment at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, thinking not about what he had, but about what he still did not have. The guy in the office next to his had just been made partner. The couple he went to college with had bought a house, a real house, in a neighborhood that felt several rungs above his apartment. His old friend from his neighborhood had built a company that had just been covered in a business magazine. Everywhere Marcus looked, he saw the distance between where he was and somewhere further that he was not. He told himself this was ambition, that this restlessness was the engine of his success, and that he should be grateful for it rather than troubled by it. And there was truth in that. His drive had produced real results. But there was also something he could not quite name. A kind of hollowness at the center of the striving, a suspicion that the satisfaction he was chasing was always exactly one achievement away and somehow never arrived. When he did allow himself to examine it, which was rare, Marcus noticed a pattern. Each achievement, each raise, each external marker of success produced a brief, bright moment of satisfaction. He would feel genuinely good for a few days, maybe a week or two, and then the landscape would reassemble itself, and there would be a new target, a new gap, a new distance to cross. The arrival never felt the way the pursuit had promised it would feel. His relationships followed the same pattern. He had been with a woman named Alina for almost 3 years. She was kind and intelligent and genuinely loved him. But Marcus found himself, in quiet moments, cataloging her limitations, comparing her to some ideal that he could not quite articulate, but that she never quite matched. He was not cruel to her. He would never have described himself as someone who took good things for granted. But a part of him was always somewhere else, scanning the horizon, comparing the real with the imagined. He worked 70-hour weeks, not because he loved his work, though he had once found something in it that interested him. He worked because the work produced the external markers that told him he was winning a race he could not stop running. He drank more than he should. He spent money on things that gave him a brief flash of pleasure, and then sat unused in corners of his apartment. He was successful by nearly every external measure and chronically, quietly miserable in a way he could not fully admit, even to himself, the question Marcus never asked. The question that might have changed everything, if he had thought to ask it early enough, was not how to get more, but why the getting never seemed to be enough. The answer was not that he was broken, or greedy, or bad. The answer was that he was chasing the feeling that things were supposed to give him, rather than examining whether those things were actually capable of delivering that feeling. What Marcus was really hungry for was not the car, or the apartment, or the partnership. What he was hungry for was something more fundamental, a sense that he was enough, that he had proven something, that the boy who wore the cheaper shoes had built a life that meant something. But here is the thing about that kind of hunger. It cannot be fed from the outside. No amount of external achievement can touch the part of a person that fears it is not enough, because that fear is not rational and it does not respond to evidence. Marcus's story is not unique. It is, in many variations, the defining story of modern ambition. It is the story of desires that are real and legitimate at their root, but have been misdirected toward targets that cannot satisfy them. The desire for security, misrouted into the endless accumulation of money past any point of genuine security. The desire for significance misrouted into the pursuit of status symbols that provide a feeling of importance for only as long as someone is watching. The desire for love misrouted into the performance of attractiveness or achievement. And what makes this pattern so difficult to escape is that it is reinforced by nearly everything in modern culture. The systems we live inside, economic systems, media systems, social media systems, all of them profit from keeping people in a state of chronic wanting. A person who is genuinely satisfied is a terrible consumer. A person who is at peace with who they are does not need to buy a new identity. A person who feels deeply connected to others does not need to perform constantly for an audience. Genuine contentment is, in a very real sense, bad for business. Marcus would eventually reach a breaking point. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quieter kind of crisis that crept up on him slowly and then arrived all at once. The sense that he was very busy going nowhere that actually mattered to him. That the life he had built, impressive from the outside, felt hollow from the inside. That he had been so focused on winning the race that he had never once stopped to ask whether the race was taking him somewhere he actually wanted to go. That question, when it finally arrived, was not comfortable, but it was, in the end, the most valuable thing that had ever happened to him, because it was the beginning of actually understanding himself. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine you could know, with absolute certainty, that no one would ever see your next major purchase. No one would know about your promotion. No one would see your body, your home, your accomplishments, or your lifestyle. Nothing you did would ever be witnessed or evaluated by another human being. Now ask yourself honestly, how many of your current desires would survive that condition? How much of what you want do you want because you genuinely want it, and how much do you want because of what it would signal to others? This is not an accusation. It is an invitation to understand one of the most powerful and least examined forces shaping human desire, the social gaze. Human beings are not just individual organisms with individual preferences. We are profoundly, inescapably social creatures, and our desires are, to a degree that most of us vastly underestimate, shaped by the people around us and the social systems we inhabit. We do not simply decide what to want in isolation. We absorb what to want from our culture, our families, our peer groups, and the media we consume. We desire things in large part because we have seen them desired by people we admire, envy, or want to belong to. The French philosopher René Girard developed an entire theory of human culture around this observation. He called it mimetic desire, the idea that human beings do not want things for their inherent qualities, but because they see others wanting them. We desire what the desire of another person tells us is desirable. The object of desire is, in Girard's view, less important than the model, the person whose desire we are imitating. We want what our models want, and we call that wanting our own preference. You can see this operating everywhere, once you know to look for it. The toy that a child desperately wants is almost always the toy that another child already has. The neighborhood that suddenly becomes desirable is almost always the neighborhood where a certain type of aspirational person is moving. The career that seems compelling to a 22-year-old is very often the career that the most admired people in their environment have chosen. We look to others to understand what is worth wanting. We outsource the formation of our desires to the social world around us, and then we experience those socially formed desires as if they were our own original hungers. Social comparison is the engine of this process. Leon Festinger, one of the most influential social psychologists of the 20th century, proposed in 1954 that human beings have a fundamental drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities, and that in the absence of objective standards, we evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to other people. This sounds like a fairly neutral observational tendency, but in practice, it has enormous consequences for desire. When you compare yourself to someone who has more, who is more successful, more attractive, more admired, the result is often a surge of desire for what they have, coupled with a diminishment of satisfaction in what you already possess. Your actual life does not change in the moment of comparison, but your experience of it does. The same apartment that felt comfortable an hour ago suddenly feels inadequate. The same salary that seemed reasonable yesterday suddenly feels insufficient. The same relationship that was satisfying before you saw someone else's relationship on social media feels somehow lacking. This is not vanity or shallowness. It is the predictable output of a social comparison system that was designed for small groups of a few dozen people operating in the same environment. In that environment, knowing where you stood relative to others had genuine survival implications. If others were getting more food than you, that was worth knowing. If others had discovered a better shelter, that was information you needed. But we no longer live in small groups of a few dozen. We live in a global media environment where we are continuously, involuntarily exposed to the most idealized, curated, and exceptional versions of other people's lives. We compare ourselves not to our actual neighbors, but to the most successful people in the entire world. We compare our ordinary Tuesday to someone else's carefully staged highlight reel, and the comparison engine does what it was designed to do. It generates desire and dissatisfaction on a massive, industrial scale. The sociologist Thorstein Veblen introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption over a century ago. The idea that much of human economic behavior is not about satisfying genuine needs, but about displaying status and signaling social position. We do not just buy houses. We buy houses that signal that we are the kind of people who can afford that kind of house. We do not just buy cars. We buy cars that communicate something about our identity and our standing. We do not just eat. We eat at restaurants that tell a story about who we are and where we belong in the social hierarchy. This is not modern cynicism. It is ancient evolutionary logic wearing contemporary clothing. In environments where resources are distributed according to social status, visible displays of status are a form of resource acquisition. The person who can signal high status attracts better alliances, more favorable treatment, and greater access to what they need. The desire to be seen as successful and admirable is not mere vanity. It is an adaptation, but the adaptation can run haywire. When the desire for status becomes untethered from genuine achievement or genuine connection, when it becomes about the performance of a life rather than the living of one, it can consume enormous amounts of energy and produce very little actual satisfaction. Because status is relative by definition, there is no level of status at which you are simply and permanently high enough. There will always be someone above you in the hierarchy. The game never ends, and the person who has organized their entire desire system around winning that game will find themselves on a treadmill that moves faster the harder they run. The genuinely counterintuitive insight here is that social comparison and status desire can be redirected rather than eliminated. The most psychologically healthy form of social comparison, supported by research, is what psychologists call self-referential comparison, comparing yourself not to others, but to your own previous self. Am I more capable than I was a year ago? Am I more honest? More connected to what actually matters to me? This form of comparison preserves the motivational energy of wanting to improve, while decoupling it from the zero-sum game of social hierarchy. It also helps to become conscious of the specific social worlds whose opinions are actually shaping your desires. Most people carry around a diffuse anxiety about what others think without ever clearly identifying who those others actually are. When you examine it closely, the imagined audience whose judgment you fear is often quite small, quite specific, and quite often composed of people who are themselves too preoccupied with their own anxieties to give you as much thought as you fear. Bringing that imagined audience into conscious awareness, naming them, examining whether their approval actually means what you think it means, is a quietly powerful act of self-liberation. The Buddha is reported to have said that desire is the root of all suffering. This is frequently misunderstood as a call to eliminate desire entirely, to reach a state of pure detachment, unmoved by anything. But a more careful reading suggests something subtler and more interesting. It is not desire itself that creates suffering, but a specific kind of desire, a clinging, grasping relationship with desire in which we believe that what we want is absolutely necessary for our well-being. The Pali word that is often translated as desire in Buddhist texts is tanha, which might be more accurately rendered as craving or thirst. It refers to the desperate, compulsive quality of desire, the experience of wanting something so urgently that its absence feels intolerable. That kind of wanting is indeed a reliable generator of suffering, because it makes your peace of mind contingent on external conditions you cannot fully control. Western psychology has arrived at similar conclusions through very different methods. The study of what makes people genuinely happy has consistently shown that one of the most reliable pathways to suffering is what researchers call contingent self-esteem. The tendency to make your sense of self-worth dependent on achieving specific outcomes. People who need to be successful to feel worthwhile are genuinely more unhappy, more anxious, and more susceptible to depression than people whose sense of self-worth is more stable and less contingent on results. This is not just a philosophical point. It has measurable psychological consequences. When your emotional well-being rides on achieving something, the anticipation of failure becomes a form of psychological emergency. You are not just afraid of missing out on something you want. You are afraid of what the failure would mean about who you are, and that fear often produces exactly the behaviors that undermine success: paralysis, avoidance, distorted thinking, excessive risk aversion, or excessive risk-taking. But there is a deeper layer to the relationship between desire and suffering that goes beyond contingent self-esteem. It has to do with the fundamental human tendency to treat the present moment as a problem to be solved by the future. When desire takes the form of, "I will be happy when," it creates a relationship with the present in which the present is always insufficient, always a waiting room for the real life that is coming once the desire is satisfied. And since, as we have seen, desires tend to regenerate quickly after satisfaction, this orientation toward the future becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary waiting period. The present moment, the only place where life actually takes place, becomes a kind of irrelevance. The philosopher Schopenhauer, who drew heavily on Eastern philosophy in developing his own vision of the human condition, described desire as a kind of will that never sleeps, that cannot be finally satisfied, that drives the organism from one object to another in an endless cycle. He was not optimistic about this. He believed that human life was fundamentally structured around this unsatisfiable will, and that the best one could achieve was brief respites from it through aesthetic experience and compassion. It is a bleak vision, but it contains a kernel of truth that more optimistic perspectives sometimes miss. Desire is, in some structural sense, never-ending. The engine does not turn off. What Schopenhauer missed, or undervalued, was the difference between the experience of wanting and the experience of longing. Wanting in the grasping, urgent sense he described is indeed a source of restlessness and frustration, but there is another quality of desire that feels more like longing or aspirations, a reach toward something meaningful that is not contaminated by the belief that your well-being depends on its arrival. This kind of desire has a different phenomenology. It is quieter, more spacious, less anxious. It motivates without demanding. It reaches without clutching. The attachment dimension of desire also explains the specific suffering that arises in loss. When we lose something we were deeply attached to, a relationship, a career, a sense of identity, a cherished hope, the pain is not just the pain of the loss itself. It is also the collision between the reality that has arrived and the reality we desired and expected. The psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl noted that suffering is fundamentally about the gap between what we have and what we believe we should have, between the world as it is and the world as we expected or needed it to be. This means that one component of reducing unnecessary suffering is not the elimination of desire, but the cultivation of what might be called flexible attachment. The capacity to hold desires and hopes genuinely and fully while also holding the possibility of their not being fulfilled with some equanimity. This is not the same as not caring. It is the difference between wanting something and needing it in a way that makes its absence an emergency. There is also the suffering that arises from what are sometimes called meta desires, the desires we have about our desires, the wish that we were different from how we are, the judgment we place on certain hungers as shameful or unworthy, the shame about wanting recognition, or wanting connection, or wanting physical pleasure, or wanting to be admired. Much human psychological energy is consumed not by the desires themselves, but by the war we wage against them. Paradoxically, the suppression of desires tends to intensify them rather than dissolve them. Research on thought suppression, famously demonstrated by the psychologist Daniel Wegner in what became known as the White Bear experiments, shows consistently that when we try to not think about something, we tend to think about it more. The same dynamic applies to desire. The person who tries to stop wanting something without understanding why they want it usually ends up preoccupied with what they are trying not to want. Understanding your desires, meeting them with curiosity rather than judgment, creates the possibility of a very different relationship with them. Not one of compulsive pursuit, not one of violent suppression, but one of honest acknowledgement, followed by a considered choice about how to respond. There is a story that researchers studying motivation return to again and again, not because it is heroic or dramatic, but because it captures something true about the difference between desire that builds a life and desire that hollows one out. In the 1970s, psychologists began studying what they called intrinsically motivated behavior in children. They would watch kids drawing and painting in their free time, freely and joyfully, because they wanted to, because the activity itself was intrinsically satisfying. Then they introduced external rewards, gold stars, certificates, praise from adults, and something strange happened. When the rewards were removed, the children's spontaneous drawing decreased. The activity that had once been its own reward had become, in the children's psychological experience, something you did to get a reward, and without the reward, the desire to do it faded. This phenomenon, which researchers called the over-justification effect, reveals something important about the architecture of healthy desire. When we are motivated by genuine interest, genuine curiosity, genuine connection to what we are doing, that motivation is self-sustaining. It does not need external management. But when desire is primarily organized around external outcomes, it becomes fragile, dependent on the continued presence of those outcomes, and disconnected from any genuine internal source of meaning. The distinction between healthy ambition and endless craving is not about the intensity of the desire. People with healthy ambition can be extraordinarily driven. They can work harder and longer than almost anyone. They can pursue their goals with a focus and persistence that looks, from the outside, almost obsessive. But there is something fundamentally different about the quality of that pursuit. It is anchored in something real. It is connected to genuine values, and crucially, it contains within it the possibility of satisfaction, because the goalpost, while always moving, is moving in a direction that is genuinely meaningful to the person pursuing it. Compulsive desire, the endless craving variety, has a different texture. It is restless in a particular way, driven not by genuine attraction towards something, but by aversion from something. The person running toward a life of meaning is in a very different inner state than the person running away from a feeling of insufficiency. They may look similar from the outside. Both are working hard. Both are ambitious. But one has a kind of aliveness and groundedness in the pursuit. The other has an urgency that never quite resolves. A sense that they are always one step ahead of something catching up with them. The philosopher and psychologist Eric Fromm drew a distinction that maps onto this territory beautifully, the difference between having and being as modes of existence. In the having mode, a person's sense of identity and security is organized around what they possess, their achievements, their possessions, their status, their relationships understood as things they own. In the being mode, identity and security are rooted in what one actually is, one's engagement with life, one's values, one's capacity for love and creativity and genuine relationship. Fromm argued that modern consumer society is structured to cultivate the having mode because it is economically productive. A person in the having mode is always acquiring, always upgrading, always trying to fill the self through external additions. A person in the being mode is less susceptible to the promises of consumer culture because their sense of self-sufficiency comes from a different place. This is not a call for poverty or rejection of the material world. The being mode does not preclude achievement or acquisition, but it changes the relationship to achievement and acquisition. In the being mode, accomplishment is an expression of who you are rather than a component of who you are. What you achieve flows from what you genuinely are and genuinely care about. It does not constitute you. One of the most reliable markers of healthy desire across cultures and across research traditions is what psychologists call self-concordance, the degree to which a goal is genuinely aligned with a person's deepest values and sense of self. Self-concordant goals are goals that you pursue not because someone else expects you to, not because they signal something desirable about you to others, but because they are genuinely expressive of who you are and what you care about. Research consistently shows that pursuing self-concordant goals produces more sustained motivation, greater well-being during the pursuit, and more genuine satisfaction upon achievement. The process of identifying which of your desires are self-concordant and which are not is one of the most valuable exercises in self-understanding. It requires a willingness to sit with some uncomfortable questions. Is this what I actually want, or what I think I should want? Would I still want this if no one would ever know I had it? Does pursuing this make me feel more like myself or less? Is this desire connected to something I genuinely value, or is it a way of running away from something I am afraid to face? These questions are not comfortable, but they are the questions that separate a life built on genuine desire from a life built on the accumulated expectations and anxieties of others. They are the questions that allow desire to serve you rather than rule you. There is also the dimension of desire that relates to effort and growth. One of the most consistent findings in the psychology of well-being is that human beings tend to find deep satisfaction not in easy achievement, but in what the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, the experience of being fully engaged in a challenging activity that is matched to your current level of skill. Not too easy, which produces boredom. Not too hard, which produces anxiety, but right at the edge of your current capability, where full attention is required and where genuine growth is occurring. Healthy desire tends to orient toward flow experiences. The desire to become more skilled, more capable, more expressive, more deeply connected to something. Compulsive craving by contrast, tends to seek shortcuts to satisfaction, the quick hit of pleasure, the fast shortcut to the feeling of achievement without the effort, the instant validation without the earned depth. One produces genuine development. The other produces the illusion of it. You are not powerless over your desires. This is perhaps one of the most important things to understand and one of the most frequently misunderstood. The neuroscience of desire does not paint a picture of a person enslaved by biology, helplessly dragged from one craving to the next. It paints a picture of a system that can be understood, worked with, gradually shaped through conscious practice. You are not separate from your desires, observing them from some vantage point of pure reason, but you are also not identical with them. There is a space, sometimes very small, sometimes larger, between the arising of a desire and your response to it. And that space, however narrow, is where freedom lives. The practice of self-regulation, as understood by modern psychology, is not the practice of suppressing desires. Research consistently shows that suppression is not only ineffective, but counterproductive. When you try to force a desire out of consciousness, it tends to come back with greater force. The person on a strict diet who tries not to think about food thinks about almost nothing else. The person who tries to stop wanting recognition finds themselves preoccupied with it. Suppression is a war you cannot win by fighting harder. What actually works is something more subtle and more interesting. It begins with awareness. The capacity to notice a desire arising, to recognize it clearly, to name it, without immediately acting on it or immediately fighting it. This sounds simple. It is not. For most people, the experience of a strong desire and the impulse to act on it are almost simultaneous. The craving arises and the hand is already reaching. The emotion surfaces and the words are already out. There is no gap, or what gap there is feels too small to matter. But awareness can be trained. The practice of mindfulness, which has moved from meditation traditions into mainstream psychology and clinical practice over the past few decades, is fundamentally the practice of increasing the gap between stimulus and response, of noticing what is arising in your experience, including desires, without being immediately swept away by it. This does not mean becoming cold or robotic. It means becoming more present and more deliberate. Research by the psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues introduced the concept of ego depletion, the idea that self-regulation draws on a limited resource, something like psychological energy, that can be depleted by overuse and restored by rest. This research has been contested and refined in the years since its introduction, but the basic intuition it points to remains valuable. Self-regulation is not just a matter of willpower in the moment. It is a capacity that needs to be managed and conserved. The person who makes dozens of difficult self-regulatory decisions throughout the day, who resists multiple temptations and navigates multiple conflicts, has less regulatory capacity left for the decision that comes in the evening. This is why behavior tends to deteriorate not in moments of peak alertness, but in moments of fatigue, hunger, and depletion. Understanding this has practical implications. Making important decisions when you are tired or depleted is genuinely unwise. Structuring your environment to reduce the number of temptations that require active resistance. Removing the object of craving from easy reach, rather than relying on willpower to resist it repeatedly, is far more effective than fighting the same battle over and over from a position of increasing exhaustion. But beyond environmental design, there is the practice of what psychologists call implementation intentions, the detailed mental planning of when, where, and how you will act in accordance with your values when a specific situation arises. Research by Peter Gollwitzer shows that forming specific, if-then plans dramatically increases follow through on intentions. It is not enough to decide that you will exercise more or spend less time on your phone or choose connection over distraction. The decision needs to be translated into specific behavioral commitments. When this specific trigger arises, I will take this specific action. The more concrete and specific the plan, the more likely behavior is to align with values. There is also the role of meaning in self-regulation that is often underappreciated. When people are connected to a larger sense of purpose, when they have a clear understanding of why they are making a particular choice, and what it is in service of, their capacity for self-regulation increases substantially. Willpower alone, the grim clenching of the teeth and forcing of behavior, is an exhausting and often losing strategy. But behavior aligned with a deeply felt purpose has a different quality. It is less effortful, not because it requires no effort, but because the effort feels like an expression of who you are rather than a fight against who you are. This is why the cultivation of self-knowledge, the careful examination of what you actually value and why, is not separate from the practical project of self-regulation. It is foundational to it. You cannot make consistently wise choices about which desires to follow and which to redirect without a clear sense of what you are actually orienting toward. And you cannot have a clear sense of that without spending real time in honest self-reflection. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome developed sophisticated practices for managing desire that remain genuinely useful thousands of years later. Their fundamental insight was not that desire should be eliminated, but that it should be examined. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, for example, involves deliberately imagining the loss of the things you have and value, your health, your relationships, your capacities, your security, not as an exercise in anxiety, but as a way of awakening appreciation for what is already present. When you genuinely imagine losing something, you often discover that you value it far more than your habitual experience of it suggests. Desire for what you already have is one of the most underrated sources of contentment. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journals, returned again and again to this theme: the capacity to want what you have. To find, in the actual texture of your existing life, sufficient richness and meaning that the craving for what is absent does not dominate your experience. This is not passive resignation. It is an active, deliberate cultivation of a different relationship with the present moment. The great paradox at the heart of desire is this: the cure for the suffering caused by unfulfilled desire is not more desire but a different quality of presence. Gratitude, which psychology researchers like Robert Emmons and Martin Seligman have studied extensively, turns out to be one of the most reliably potent interventions for well-being known to science. People who regularly practice gratitude, who deliberately attend to what is already good in their lives, report higher levels of happiness, lower levels of depression and anxiety, better sleep, stronger relationships, and greater resistance to the effects of adversity. These effects are not trivial. They are substantial enough to rival the effects of antidepressants in some studies, without the side effects. But why does gratitude work? The neuroscience points to something interesting. Gratitude practice appears to shift the pattern of what the brain habitually attends to. The brain, remember, is a prediction and attention machine. It is designed to seek out discrepancies, gaps, problems, and deficits, because those are the things that required urgent action in the environment in which it evolved. The practice of gratitude is, in effect, a deliberate counter-programming of that default attentional habit. It trains the brain to notice what is present rather than what is absent, what is working rather than what is broken, what has been given rather than what is still owed. This does not make problems disappear. It does not eliminate legitimate desires or turn suffering into joy through the magic of positive thinking. Gratitude is not a tool for bypassing reality. It is a tool for perceiving reality more fully, including those parts of it that the default wanting and fixing brain habitually overlooks. There is also the dimension of meaning that transcends desire in the usual sense. The psychologist Martin Seligman, in his research on well-being, found that the element of flourishing that correlates most strongly with deep and lasting fulfillment is not pleasure, not achievement, and not even positive relationships, as important as those are. It is meaning, the sense that your life is in service of something larger than yourself. People who experience their work and relationships as meaningful, as connected to values that extend beyond their own immediate desires, report a quality of well-being that has a different character from the brief, bright satisfaction of desire, fulfillment. It is quieter, more stable, more resilient in the face of difficulty. Meaning is not found. It is created, or more precisely, it is discovered through engagement with life, through commitment to things that matter, through the willingness to be changed by what you love and what you care for. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be performed. It is the product of genuine presence in genuine relationship, whether that relationship is with another person, with a craft, with a community, with a purpose, or with the natural world. There is a concept in Japanese culture called ikigai, loosely translated as the reason for being. It describes the intersection of four elements: what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. At the center of that intersection is something that Japanese culture believes is essential to a life well lived. A sense that your presence in the world is genuinely connected to something that matters. What is striking about ikigai as a framework is that it does not ask you to suppress desire. It asks you to direct it, to find the confluence point where what you genuinely want, what you genuinely can do, what is genuinely needed, and what is genuinely sustainable all come together. This is not a guarantee of an easy life, but it is a prescription for one that feels, at its center, inhabited rather than merely endured. The cultivation of genuine interest and wonder is also underappreciated as a source of fulfillment beyond desire in the craving sense. The philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, reflecting near the end of a long and turbulent life, wrote that the secret to happiness was simple: let your interests be as wide as possible, and let your reactions to people and things be, as far as possible, friendly rather than hostile. This sounds almost comically simple, but it points to something real about the quality of life available to a person who meets the world with genuine curiosity rather than with the appraising, comparing, consuming attention of the desire machine. The child who looks at a caterpillar with genuine wonder is not pursuing any particular goal. They are not acquiring anything. They are not comparing themselves to anyone. They are simply present with something genuinely interesting. That quality of attention, that capacity for genuine interest without agenda, is available to adults too. It does not go away, but it tends to get crowded out by the constant noise of wanting and comparing and planning and reviewing. Learning to hear it again, to let genuine curiosity and wonder have more space in your inner life, is one of the quieter but more profound shifts available to a person who wants to live more fully. And then there is presence itself, not as a spiritual concept, but as a practical one. The capacity to be fully where you are, fully engaged with what is actually in front of you, is in some ways the most direct counter to the suffering that comes from desire, not because it eliminates desire, but because it interrupts the pattern by which the mind perpetually escapes the present into either the imagined past or the imagined future. Most suffering caused by desire is located in the gap between what is and what we wish were. Presence collapses that gap, not by changing what is, but by bringing full attention to it. Let me tell you about a woman named Priya. Priya was 41 years old when she first started paying serious attention to her desires. Not to their content. She had been paying attention to that for her entire adult life. The desire for a certain career, the desire for a certain kind of relationship, the desire to be seen as successful by the people whose opinions she had decided were worth caring about. What she started paying attention to was their structure, the pattern, the way they arose and moved and dissipated and regenerated. She had not arrived at this attention through wisdom. She had arrived there through exhaustion. A difficult year had accumulated into a kind of quiet crisis. A project she had poured herself into had not produced the recognition she expected. A relationship she had hoped would develop had not materialized in the form she wanted. Her body, which she had been pushing hard for years, was starting to object. And somewhere in the intersection of all these disappointments, she found herself unable to muster the usual energy for the usual wanting. She was not depressed, exactly. She was something else, something harder to name, a kind of enforced stillness, as if the machinery of desire had temporarily ground to a halt, and she was standing in the sudden quiet, looking at her life without the forward momentum she had always used to avoid looking at it too carefully. And in that quiet, she started to notice things. She noticed first how much of what she had wanted over the past decade she had wanted, because she believed getting it would make her feel a certain way, safe, worthy, admired, complete. She noticed that these feelings had rarely arrived in the way she expected, even when the things themselves arrived. The promotion had produced a brief, bright glow and then a new hunger. The relationship had been genuine and nourishing in many ways, but had not filled the specific longing she had attributed to it. The achievements had been real, but their capacity to produce the feelings she had expected of them was consistently, puzzlingly limited. She noticed, second, how much of her energy had gone not toward actually living but toward managing the distance between where she was and where she was supposed to be. Supposed to be according to whom, she was not always sure, but the supposed to be was constant, a kind of background noise that had been so familiar she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing traffic noise in a city. She began, slowly and tentatively at first, to ask different questions. Not what do I want next, but what do I actually find meaningful? Not what should I be pursuing, but what, when I am honest with myself, genuinely lights something up in me. Not how do I get to the next level, but what is the life I would want to be living if the life I am living is already it? These were uncomfortable questions. They required a kind of honesty that the momentum of pursuing had always allowed her to defer. They required looking at some desires and recognizing that they had been borrowed rather than chosen. They required acknowledging that some of what she had called ambition had actually been avoidance, running toward achievement partly to stay ahead of an inner voice that said she was not enough. What surprised her most was what she found. When she sat with those questions long enough, it was not emptiness or nihilism or the gray flatness she had feared. It was something quieter and more real. A set of genuine interests, genuine values, genuine desires that had been present all along beneath the noise of the performed ones. A genuine love for certain kinds of work that she had been abandoning in favor of more prestigious looking alternatives. A genuine need for a certain quality of connection that no amount of surface sociality had been satisfying. A genuine desire for time, actual unhurried time that she had been unconsciously trading away for things she thought she should want more. The shift that followed was not dramatic. Priya did not quit her job or move to a mountain or have a spiritual awakening in any form she could have described to others. What shifted was subtler and more important, her relationship to her desires. She began to hold them with more curiosity and less urgency. She began to notice the difference between the wanting that came from genuine attraction and the wanting that came from anxiety or comparison. She began to make choices, small choices, incremental choices, that were slightly more aligned with what she actually valued and slightly less shaped by what she thought others expected of her. She found that this kind of living required, above all, a willingness to tolerate the discomfort of not constantly moving. The machinery of desire is noisy, and one of its most reliable tricks is to make stillness feel like danger, to make reflection feel like laziness, to make the question, "What do I actually want?" feel like an indulgence compared to the productive, urgent activity of chasing what you have already decided to want. Priya learned that the discomfort was not danger. It was the necessary discomfort of becoming more herself, of shedding, slowly and not always gracefully, desires that had never been hers in the first place, of making room for desires that were quieter and more real and less photogenic, but far more sustaining. She could not have told you that she was happy in the cheerful, uncomplicated sense, but she could have told you that she felt more honest, more genuinely present in her own life, more able to look at what was actually in front of her, without the constant, restless scanning of the horizon that had characterized her previous years. That was, she discovered, a form of freedom she had not known she was missing. We have traveled a long distance together, from the ancient biology of desire, through the neuroscience of dopamine and anticipation, through the social forces that shape what we want, through the relationship between desire and suffering, through the distinction between healthy ambition and compulsive craving, through the practices that allow greater self-regulation and self-knowledge. And perhaps what strikes you now, standing at the end of that journey, is how much the territory of desire is also just the territory of being human. Desire is not a problem to be solved. It is not a weakness to be overcome. It is not a sign that something is wrong with you or that you are less spiritually evolved than people who appear to want less. Desire is the aliveness in you. It is the reaching, the striving, the caring, the connecting force that makes you capable of love and creation and growth. To be free of desire would not be liberation. It would be a kind of death. What we are talking about, what this entire exploration has been building toward, is not the elimination of desire, but the development of a wiser relationship with it, a relationship in which you are the author of your desires, rather than simply their vehicle, in which you can distinguish between the desire that comes from your genuine self and the desire that has been manufactured for you by a culture that profits from your discontent, in which you can pursue what matters with real energy and commitment while holding it lightly enough that its presence or absence does not determine the quality of your experience. This is not a destination. There is no final state of perfect clarity you will reach after which desire is no longer complicated. Life will keep arriving with its invitations and provocations and distractions. You will keep wanting things, some of them wonderful and some of them confusing, and some of them that you cannot quite explain. The practice is ongoing, but the quality of the practice, the degree of honest awareness you bring to your inner life, the willingness to ask not just what do I want, but why do I want this, and what do I think it will give me, and what does my wanting this tell me about what I actually need. That ongoing practice is itself a form of deep living. It is the practice of taking your own experience seriously, of treating your inner life not as noise to be managed, but as signal to be understood. There is something profound and quietly revolutionary about a person who can look at their own desires with genuine curiosity, rather than compulsive reactivity or harsh judgment, who can recognize the evolutionary heritage of their hungers without being enslaved by it, who can participate in the social world while remaining aware of how much of what they want has been shaped by that world, who can pursue meaningful goals with genuine commitment while maintaining the flexibility to re-examine whether those goals are still genuinely theirs. That person is not a saint. They are not free from the ordinary suffering of wanting things that do not arrive and losing things that matter. But they have something that chronic, unconscious desire chasing does not provide, a genuine authorship of their own life, a sense that the choices they make come from somewhere real in themselves, that the life they are building actually reflects what they value. This is what the deepest inquiry into desire is always ultimately about. Not the desires themselves, but the self that does the desiring. When you understand your desires, you begin to understand yourself. And when you understand yourself, you begin to live not as a passenger in the vehicle of your own hungers, but as someone genuinely at the wheel. The quality of your desires shapes the quality of your life. Every philosopher who has thought carefully about this has arrived at some version of that statement. Every wisdom tradition, every serious psychologist, and perhaps you have arrived at some version of it too, over the course of this exploration. What you desire and how you hold that desiring determines what you reach for and what you build, and who you become over the long arc of your life. Unconscious desire is fate. Conscious desire is choice. You have begun the practice of making your desire conscious. That is no small thing. In fact, it may be the most important thing. Desire is not something to eliminate. It is something to understand, because the quality of your desires shapes the quality of your life. And when you learn to direct desire instead of being controlled by it, you begin to live with greater freedom, clarity, and purpose. That freedom is available to you. It has always been available. It begins with the willingness to stop and ask, honestly and without judgment, the question most people never think to ask. Why do I want what I want? That question is not the end. It is the beginning, and every genuine beginning in a life fully lived is a gift.